The Somali Civil War. You hear about it, and it's like, whoa, this massive, endless conflict, right? One of the longest running in Africa. It started back in 1991, and we're still seeing it play out in different ways today. So how do you even begin to wrap your head around something this complex?
Well, that's exactly what we're doing in this deep dive.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
It is. We've gone through a ton of analysis, and we're pulling out the core pieces, the essential stuff, to help you understand what's going on in Somalia without drowning in all the details.
It's like trying to find the signal in the noise, right?
Exactly.
We're going to explore the historical roots, figure out why it started, why it's kept going for so long, look at the major phases it's gone through, the key players both inside Somalia and those influencing things from outside, and of course the lasting impact it's had.
And for you, our listeners, why should you care about what's happening halfway across the world?
Great question.
Because Somalia gives us this really powerful lens to look at some really huge global issues.
Like what kinds of things? We're talking about state collapse, what it looks like when a country basically falls apart. We see the huge influence of clan structures, how those traditional systems can really shape a society's path, for better or worse. And then there's the rise of extremist groups, like where do they come from and how do they thrive in this kind of chaotic environment? And finally, we're going to look at international intervention. What happens when outside powers try to step in, and how those efforts can sometimes have totally unintended consequences.
You know, it's fascinating because so often those interventions, they're meant to help, but things just get even more tangled.
It's a complicated picture for sure. So we've got all this amazing analysis, and our mission here is to extract that critical knowledge to give you a clear, concise understanding.
All right, sounds like a plan.
So let's go all the way back to the beginning. Somalia, 1960.
Okay, so back then you had British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland. They came together, and boom, you've got the independent Republic of Somalia. Interestingly, the early years weren't total chaos. There was actually a functioning democracy for a while.
No.
Things change.
Yeah, that stability, it doesn't last. We fast forward to 1969, and General Siad Barre comes in with this military coup. This is a huge turning point. Barre takes over, sets up this authoritarian regime. The analysis talks about his idea of scientific socialism, but what you really see is him suppressing any opposition, silencing dissent, and favoring certain clans over others. And you can imagine that sets the stage for a lot of resentment, a lot of simmering anger that's eventually going to boil over.
It's like he created this pressure cooker, right? You keep pushing down those different groups, and eventually something's got to give.
Exactly. And by 1991, it does. The resistance movements, fueled by all these clan-based groups, they finally overthrow Barre's government and boom, full-blown civil war. The central government just dissolves, leaving this massive power vacuum. And here's where things get really interesting. Because the sources point to a few key factors that turn this collapse into such a prolonged and violent conflict.
Okay, so it's not just about one guy being in charge or not. It's much deeper than that.
Way deeper. Let's start with the immediate aftermath of Barre's fall.
All right, so the analysis really emphasizes that none of the rebel groups that fought against Barre were strong enough on their own to take control and establish a new government. Groups like the United Somali Congress, they played a big role in ousting Barre, but they couldn't come together, form a cohesive, unified government.
And that inability to form a strong central government, that's what allows these deep-seated clan dynamics to really explode in a destructive way.
Right, because it's important to understand, Somali society, it's traditionally been organized around these major clans. You've got the Hawe, Darud, Deer, Isaac, and others. These clans, they've always been central to how things work, both socially and politically.
They provide this kind of framework, this sense of belonging and identity.
Exactly. But in this situation, without a strong national government, these clan structures, instead of bringing people together, they become the basis for the conflict.
It's like they become weaponized, right?
Exactly. Clan identity becomes super politicized, and these groups start forming militias, fighting each other for control of land, resources, power.
So from 1991 to about 2004, there's this huge power vacuum.
No real central authority. Different warlords are basically in charge of different regions, and it's just chaos.
And then into this mix, you have the rise of extremism. The analysis talks about how this lack of governance, this vacuum, it created this perfect breeding ground for Islamist groups to emerge.
Like a petri dish, almost.
Right. Exactly. And that leads to the rise of Al-Shabaab, who eventually aligned themselves with Al-Qaeda. And suddenly the conflict takes on a whole new dimension. It's not just clan against clan anymore.
You've got this powerful ideological element added to the mix.
It's no longer just about land or resources. It's about establishing a very specific vision of an Islamic state.
And that really ups the stakes.
Absolutely. And then on top of all this internal turmoil, you've got the outside world getting involved.
Oh, yeah, the interventions.
The analysis highlights the roles of neighboring countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, Eritrea, and global powers like the U.S. and the UN. And what's interesting is a lot of these interventions, they were intended to bring stability, but they often had unintended consequences that just made the conflict even worse.
You see this pattern over and over again, where good intentions don't always translate into good outcomes.
Right. Like focusing on counterterrorism sometimes actually empowered certain warlords who were also fighting against the targeted groups.
Yeah.
So you end up strengthening the very instability you're trying to combat. It's a mess.
A real catch-22.
So we've got this backdrop, the historical roots, the initial causes. Now let's dive into the key phases of this long war. The analysis breaks it down into 4 main periods, starting with what they call the Age of Warlords from 1991 to 2000. What defined this era?
Okay, so as the name suggests, this period is all about warlords and their clan militias. After Barre is gone, the country basically splinters along these clan lines. The analysis mentions the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993, and of course the Black Hawk Down incident. This event had a huge impact. It led to the U.S. pulling out its forces and everyone else becoming way more cautious about getting involved. And during this time, you also see regions like Somaliland and Puntland declaring autonomy, which shows just how deeply divided the nation had become.
It's like everyone's looking out for themselves. There's no sense of a unified Somalia anymore.
Right, it's every clan for itself.
Then we move into the next phase, the brief rise of Islamic courts from 2000 to 2006. What led to this shift?
Well, it's really fascinating. Out of all that chaos and warlordism, you see this new force emerge, a coalition of Islamic courts, the ICU. They managed to take control of Mogadishu, and for a short time, they actually bring some order to the capital.
So they're offering a different model, a different vision for Somalia.
Exactly, but Ethiopia, Somalia's neighbor, they get nervous. They're worried about this radical Islamic state forming right on their border. So in 2006, Ethiopia, backed by the U.S., invades Somalia and topples the ICU.
But that intervention, as we've discussed, it has this huge unintended consequence.
Yeah, it basically paves the way for Al-Shabaab.
Al-Shabaab, they were like this more extreme wing of the ICU.
Right, they were a faction within the ICU, but much more radical.
And when the ICU is taken down, those guys, they regroup, they go underground, and they launch this brutal insurgency.
And that marks the beginning of the third phase.
The insurgency and international response, which runs from 2007 to the present. So this phase is all about Al-Shabaab's control of significant territory and everyone's efforts to combat them. We see the deployment of AMISOM, the African Union mission in Somalia, with troops from Kenya, Ethiopia, and support from the U.S. They managed to retake Mogadishu in 2011, which is a big victory, but Al-Shabaab, they're still a major threat.
They're resilient. They've been pushed out of the cities, but they haven't gone away. They adapt. They carry out these devastating attacks, and they're still a major force to be reckoned with.
And through all this, you see the continued involvement of regional and international actors, everyone trying to figure out how to navigate this incredibly complex and dangerous situation. And that brings us to the 4th phase, from 2012 to today, the fragile state and continued division. What are the hallmarks of this more recent period?
Well, the big event here is the establishment of the Federal Government of Somalia, the FGS, in 2012. This was a big step towards creating a more unified, internationally recognized government. But the FGS faces massive challenges. They struggle to extend their authority across the whole country. Somaliland and Puntland, they're still doing their own thing, mostly independent. And then there's the constant threat of terrorist attacks, clan conflicts still simmering in certain regions, and outside powers meddling, all contributing to this ongoing instability.
So it's a mixed bag. On one hand, you have a recognized government. On the other, there's still so much division, so much fragility.
Exactly. It's a slow and difficult process, and there's no guarantee of success.
Okay, so we've walked through the timeline, the different stages. Now let's zoom in on the key players, both those inside Somalia and those influencing things from the outside. Who are the major domestic actors that the analysis highlights?
All right, so on the domestics front, we start with the warlords and clan militias that were calling the shots back in the 90s. The analysis specifically mentions Mohammed Farah Aidid. He was a big player during that chaotic period. Then you have the Islamic Courts Union, The ICU, who, as we talked about, held power for a brief time. Al-Shabaab is, of course, a major player, still active, still pushing their ideology of a strict Islamic state. And lastly, there's the FGS, the federal government of Somalia. They're the internationally recognized government, but they still face a ton of internal challenges, questions about their legitimacy, and struggles to actually control the country.
So it's a crowded field.
Oh yeah, with a lot of competing interests and agendas.
And then beyond Somalia's borders, the international involvement has been really extensive, really complex. Who are the key international actors we need to understand?
Okay, so on the international stage, you've got the UN, the United Nations. They've played a role, but their peacekeeping missions back in the 90s, they weren't very successful. Then there's the US, the United States. They were involved in the 90s with that intervention, and more recently, they've mainly been supporting counterterrorism efforts.
So their involvement has shifted over time.
Exactly. Now, you can't forget Ethiopia and Kenya. They've both sent troops into Somalia to fight Al-Shabaab, mainly driven by their own security concerns.
They're right next door, so they've got a lot at stake.
Yeah, they see Al-Shabaab as a direct threat. Then you have the African Union, the AU, with AMISOM, providing a lot of the ground troops trying to stabilize the country.
The boots on the ground.
Exactly. And finally, you have the Gulf states, places like the UAE, Qatar, and Turkey. They've been trying to exert influence by funding different groups within Somalia, sometimes playing different sides against each other.
So it's a complex web of international involvement.
Yeah, a lot of players, a lot of competing interests.
And all of this conflict, all this instability, it's had a devastating impact on the people of Somalia. The analysis goes into some of the most significant consequences of this long war. Let's start with the human cost. What are we talking about here?
Well, the human cost is immense. The analysis estimates that over 500,000 people have died since 1991, either directly from the fighting or indirectly from things like famine and disease. Millions more have been displaced from their homes, creating a massive refugee crisis. And then there's the famines, notably in 2011 and 2017, often made worse by the conflict and severe drought conditions.
So it's not just about the fighting itself, it's the ripple effects, the way it impacts every aspect of life.
Exactly. Food security,
Right.
access to water, healthcare, education, everything is affected.
And beyond the human tragedy, the war has also created big problems for regional security.
Absolutely. Al-Shabaab, they're not just a threat to Somalia. They operate across borders, launching attacks in Kenya, Ethiopia, destabilizing the whole region.
It's got a broad reach.
And then there's the issue of piracy off the Somali coast. That was a huge problem in the 2000s, directly linked to the lack of effective governance, the lawlessness in Somalia.
So it's a security nightmare for the region, and it's had global consequences.
Right, those pirates were disrupting international shipping, causing all kinds of economic damage.
And within Somalia itself, the war has led to what the analysis calls political paralysis. And of course, there's the economic devastation.
Yeah, politically, the government is still really fragile. There are constant power struggles, corruption, and a lack of effective governance. It's really hard to make progress to rebuild the country with all that going on.
It's like one step forward, two steps back.
Exactly. And economically, the country's really struggling. They're heavily reliant on remittances, money sent back from Somalis living abroad, and on exports of livestock. And of course, they depend on international aid. The infrastructure is in ruins after decades of war. The industries are shattered. It's a really difficult situation.
So looking ahead, what's the outlook for Somalia? The analysis talks about some ongoing challenges and potential paths forward. What does the future hold?
Well, the analysis doesn't sugarcoat things. Somalia still faces massive obstacles. Al-Shabaab is still a threat. The government is weak and divided. Outside powers are still meddling. And there's the constant risk of drought and famine.
So it's a pretty grim picture.
Yeah, it's tough. But there's some glimmers of hope. The analysis suggests that strengthening Somali institutions, building up effective governance from within, that's crucial. They also talk about the importance of sustained support from the African Union and the UN, and reducing the influence of outside powers, those proxy conflicts, that could help create space for Somalis to come together to build trust and work towards peace. And finally, investing in economic development, that's key to addressing the root causes of instability and creating a more hopeful future.
So it sounds like there's no easy fix. It's a long-term process that requires commitment from everyone involved.
Exactly. There's no magic bullet. It's going to take time, effort, and a lot of cooperation.
All right, so let's wrap this up. Our deep dive into the Somali Civil War, based on all this fantastic analysis, has really painted a picture of just how complex and challenging this situation is. It was triggered by the collapse of Siad Barre's regime way back in 1991, and it's been fueled by this mix of clan rivalries, the rise of extremism, and a long history of outside involvement, often with unintended consequences. The human cost has been enormous, and the struggle for lasting peace, it's still ongoing.
And for our listeners, taking the time to understand this conflict, it gives you a really valuable framework for thinking about other conflicts around the world.
It helps you see the patterns, the interplay of all these factors that drive and sustain conflict.
You start to recognize the historical grievances, the power dynamics within a society, and the often messy and unpredictable results of outside interventions.
It's a complex picture, but understanding it helps us make sense of the world around us.
Abs-
So here's a final thought to leave you with. What happens to a society after decades of state collapse? How do you even begin to rebuild trust, to establish effective governance after so much fragmentation, so much trauma? And what role can outsiders play in helping to foster peace without inadvertently making things worse? What needs to change within Somalia itself for there to be lasting stability, a real chance for a brighter future? These are huge questions, really important questions, and they're at the heart of the ongoing story of this incredibly resilient nation.
It's a story worth paying attention to.
Absolutely.